Welcome back, everybody, to Neutrality Studies. My name is Pascal Lotta, and today I have the very great pleasure of having with me two great brains. Ola Tunander, a professor emeritus at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, and Rainer Rupp, a former NATO top analyst and spy for East Germany. Ola, Rainer, welcome.
Thank you.
My pleasure. See you again. And to meet Ola.
It's wonderful having you both here because I've talked to both of you separately, and actually recently, Rainer, you and we had a talk, and then Ola, he reacted to that and actually wrote an article on his Substack about a topic that we should expand on today: the U.S. nuclear umbrella. Does it exist? And you made the point in this article that a lot of the beliefs about what this umbrella is or is not is actually quite mistaken. So, and I would love to go further into that, but now let me maybe ask Rainer. Let's start maybe with you. Like, where does the idea of the nuclear umbrella come from? And when you were working at NATO, how important was that as a subject?
Let's start with the first question. Where it does come from? The nuclear umbrella is intimately, interwoven in with the idea of deterrence. So if I am hit, then I'll hit you back. I have the escalation domination. I hit you back if necessary with a nuclear weapon. Now, we also have to distinguish here nuclear weapons as the weapon of last resort, nuclear weapons as a political weapon for blackmail, like Israel is doing for quite a while already, and a nuclear weapon as a deterrent weapon, so that the other person does not, or the opponent doesn't get the idea of using his own nuclear weapon. Now, this type aspect of deterrence worked during the Cold War relatively well, although there were a number of efforts, primarily from the United States, from U.S. warmongers who were dissatisfied with this concept because it was like a corset around the offensive ideas in other areas. So the original idea was, in the 1960s, in the early 1960s, where there were not even a remote possibility of defending against nuclear attacks on each side, the situation developed under the term of MAD, mutually assured destruction. If you hit me, I'll hit you back, and we both are dead, because there were sufficient weapons on each side, and the idea of hitting all of the enemy in the first stroke didn't. That was originally a fear. As a result, you doubled and tripled, each side doubled and tripled their nuclear capacities and attack weapons. So in case there is a first try for a first decapitation strike, you still have enough to destroy the enemy. And not just, and as a result, also the so-called triad began to exist or was created. You had nuclear weapons based on submarines, you had nuclear weapons based on land, and you had nuclear weapons carried by air. So if one fails, the other still could. So the idea to destroy the world was quite perfected to the point. Now, the problem was, of course, in this particular case, then the Europeans, who had felt originally, when the Americans dominated, were the only ones with nuclear weapons, and were the only ones for a long time with the very advanced miniaturization, of nuclear weapons into the just down to 1 kiloton, etc. you remember, I think Hiroshima had 20 kilotons. Yeah, if my memory, I'm getting old too. I mean,
15, I think. Yeah. Okay.
I mean,
15?
just to get
Oh.
15
idea, 1 kiloton is huh?
15
How
in
much was Hiroshima?
15, I think.
15.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Anyway, to get the idea, so the Europeans began to feel. I mean, as long as the Americans had that dominance, the Europeans felt quite safe under this deterrence umbrella. That was when the umbrella was actually coined, and then a bit later, when the Russians were drawing equal, the deterrence umbrella, I mean, the nuclear umbrella, got some holes, especially when what was it called? The Start One was signed, or what was the original? I mean, the balance was there, and the Europeans, especially the Germans, you must not forget the German special situation, especially the Germans were very concerned that in a case of a conventional conflict, the NATO, or NATO being the United States, would not use nuclear weapons in case the conventional forces would collapse. So here we already see something which originally didn't exist, which was if conventional defense fails, you use nuclear weapons. That was already another lowering of the threshold for nuclear weapons in this development. And with the miniaturization of nuclear weapons, this threshold became even lower and lower. So the Germans were thinking, oh, wow, if there is really a nuclear, I mean, if there's really a conventional conflict which we cannot control, and I could actually quote here from MC 161, on the cover page, in fact, not on the cover page, but on the first page of this cosmic top secret, very voluminous document, I mean, consisting of over 40 documents, quoted about Soviet strategy, that the Soviets, I mean, I just stood the Soviet Union, or the Soviet military doctrine is not based on a attack on Western Europe. But if there is an armed conflict, and if there is an attack against socialist territory, we have to make sure that the war is not being fought and the destructions will not happen on socialist territory. That's, of course, from the experience of the great war, the Second World War, where the western part of the Soviet Union, I mean, all the way up to Moscow, was completely destroyed. I mean, so that would and should not happen, and in that respect, we will just steamroll the Europeans. So,
Hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube, and although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascalotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below, and now back to the video.
in this situation, the German leadership been thinking about, well, what is actually the nuclear deterrence against such a conventional attack if it happens? And we had right after in the early 1950s, the Americans had the Honest John missile deployed in Germany, and that was a nuclear-armed missile with a warhead that could vary and couldn't be too big, because this nuclear-armed missile had a maximum reach of, guess, 25 kilometers. 25 kilometers at the maximum payload of, I think it was, I noted it down here, hold on, a maximum payload of, come on, of 2 to 30 kilotons. I mean, it had a payload, the smallest 2 kilotons up to 30 kilotons, and a reach of 15.4 miles, meaning 25 kilometers. Now, well, what you know what it means. Then in the 1960, 1961, a upgraded version of the Onestron was introduced with a maximum reach of 48 to 50 kilometers. It had a stronger engine, stronger rocket engine, and it was, let me see how many kilotons it actually had. It could carry up to 100 kilotons. But then at 100 kilotons, it couldn't reach the maximum reach of, 50 kilometers. So it was actually very dangerous for the missile company to to operate something like that. But that was the standard of the American and Bundeswehr nuclear equipment, with the difference between U.S. forces and Bundeswehr. The Bundeswehr could not use the nuclear weapons as they liked. They always needed American consent, or and the key to arm each individual nuclear weapons. But all in all, there were about over 700 of these the tactical nuclear warheads deployed with appropriate Onestron missiles, and it continued in I think in the 1970s. Hold on, I just have to have a look. The Lance nuclear-armed missile was then introduced, and it had a reach of 120 to 130 kilometers, again with a maximum payload of 100 kilotons. And it was introduced, this missile, the Lance, was introduced in 1972, and the last Lances actually were decommissioned from Germany after 1995.
Oh my God. But may I just ask, so, that means the whole strategy of this nuclear umbrella, of these nuclear missiles, was to reach at best East Germany and then cause fallout there. And Ola, I think you write about exactly that, right? The whole point was then that this basically, if it ever came to a nuclear escalation, it would mean the annihilation of Germany and basically Central Europe. Ola, can you speak to
and Eastern Europe, Eastern Europe. We push the Russians back to East Germany and to the border. The Russians wouldn't disappear. Then Poland and all those good American friends, all those who are good American friends nowadays wouldn't even exist if it's actually happened.
It's clear that, of course, that they would attack Polish territory by attacking the second echelon of Soviet forces coming in and so on. But still, the first attacks would be against German territory, against East German territory, but also against West German territory, because you will start, supposedly, you will start the war when the Soviet forces enter West Germany. So it would be, the destruction will be primarily in Germany.
Complete. You haven't yet even discussed you haven't even mentioned the so-called nuclear mines, which were all stationed about 30 kilometers away from the also U.S.-controlled 30 all along the German East German border, and a distance of about 30 k's from the border.
And also, I spoke with a former commander-in-chief for BALTOP, the Baltic Approaches command in NATO, and he said that they had this special forces having rucksacks with nuclear weapons, and my impression is that they wouldn't go very far. There is a limitation for how far you could run with your nuclear weapon, and how, if you would be able to run back, so to speak. So it was a suicide policy, and I remember that Sweden were developing nuclear weapons in the 50s and early 60s, and it was stopped, I think, sometime in early 60s, but it's actually, that was formally, I think, in 72, but it was stopped. The development was stopped in early 60s, I think. And the argument for one, the most responsible official in the defense ministry in Sweden, he argued also that the nuclear umbrella, that United States would cover Sweden with its nuclear umbrella, and then Sweden gave up its nuclear weapons program. So that was the idea, but still, I mean, in Norway you had the same logic. You couldn't, and Rainer described, in your last interview, that none of the NATO exercises had attacks on the Soviet Union, of these Vintex exercises, and that was, and of course, the Americans knew that if you attack Soviet Union, the Soviet Union will attack you back on US, and the Americans preferred to have the fight in Europe. So, and the same was, of course, in North Norway, because the Finnmark county in very far north of Norway was a part that Soviet Union would occupy in case of a major war, because they were afraid of the attacks on the Kola Peninsula bases. The very strategic bases on the Kola Peninsula, with the submarine bases, the Air Force bases, the missile bases, all of this were extremely vital for the Soviet Union. So they would go into Finnmark County. And of course, this is part of Norway, and Norway would try to defend against a Soviet attack on Finnmark. But they had not the major defense line on the Norwegian side were close to Troms, actually the next county. So it was so they knew that the Soviets would take Finnmark. Actually, they would not be able to defend really, but it was the nuclear weapons would be used against the Soviet troops entering Finnmark. And I have a friend who was up with some French defense specialist, and they looked at this. Finnmark is a huge area with almost no population at all, and they said this is ideal for use of nuclear weapons. And so, but the problem was, of course, the Norwegians were not too happy about that the nuclear weapons were going to be used in Norway.
Especially not the Lapps.
But this is quite important, actually. I did some research also on the neutral center bomb. And Sweden is not the only one. The Swiss were also building building a bomb in the 50s and 60s, or they were working on it. And there are several factors for why they gave it up. But one of the important ones was when the military in the mid 60s to late 60s started understanding that the military doctrine of Switzerland of using its weapons only on Swiss soil. The doctrine was we will never use it outside of Swiss soil, only inside Switzerland. That means that if you develop nuclear weapons, you would nuke your own country. The point was that until the mid 60s, people didn't quite understand what it meant if you nuke a place, right? That you basically permanently destroy that area, and the nuclear fallout, what it would do. So actually, the early Cold War nuclear umbrella was in that sense built around the idea, no, nuclear weapons are the next level of conventional weapons, right? And we will use them against the approaching armies. And that, that's not really an umbrella, is it? That's more a counter-strike capability.
Yeah, and even more clear, you could say, it is when you look at the Nike missiles, that was air defense missiles, and you had them around the Nike batteries around Oslo, you had around Copenhagen, you had in Germany, you had down in Holland and Belgium, and they had conventional, in Norway at least, they had conventional warheads, but that was for peacetime. I mean, it was just for pretending that for pretending to defend Oslo. And you told the politicians that you want, and also on the military side, you told them, a lot of military people, that these missiles were going to be used to defend Norway against air attack from Soviet Union. That was what one believed. And a friend of mine, who was heading these missile systems in Norway, and later became chief of military intelligence in Norway, Alf Raberg, he told that, yeah, but we had the storage for the nuclear weapons at these Nike batteries, and these were going to be used in war times. So, I mean, you're just pretending that you're going to use conventional weapons, because the point with these Nike missiles were to take down the swarms of air bombers, the Soviet nuclear bombers going towards Britain. And they were, like birds, they go many together, and they would take, one would believe that when you try to shoot them down, you shoot one or two, but most of them will pass by. But if you use nuclear weapons, you destroy all these swarms of Soviet nuclear bombers on its way to Britain. So so it means that you shoot all these nuclear weapons upright above you, and the fallout will come on you, and it's not ideal, and then I was thinking about this nuclear umbrella, that actually the rain with the radiation would come from inside the umbrella. So it's the opposite what it's supposed to do, so to speak.
Rainer, I mean, this is pretty crazy, but I mean, this was the planning of NATO. I mean, weren't these people aware that they're actually talking about the nuclear destruction of Europe by building this kind of defense strategy?
I think they were aware, if it would happen, that would be it. But I've in my first times when I was participating in the Vintex exercises, I was absolutely surprised that from the moment I mean, that at the very first time for me, it was just one tactical nuke fell on Eastern Europe. Then the exercise was finished.
Why?
Why? Yeah, I asked that. Nobody could answer me. One older soldier. I was still a young man, and one of these older soldiers um, from the military commission, because in NATO headquarters, according to NATO, the dominance of the political part, we are civilians. Of course, as we are dealing with military issues, we have also a military committee for every country, have a military staff, and also an international military staff in NATO headquarters itself. And these military experts, and most of them, in fact, either strategy experts or they're coming from military intelligence. And in the case of the people who I worked together in during Vintex in the current intelligence group, they were mostly from military intelligence, and there was the level was between lieutenant colonel or colonel, the occasional general was there, but one of these older colleagues, when I asked him, he said, "Well, what is there else would be left to discuss? Let be finished." Yeah.
As in, if one tactical nuke drops, then basically Europe is gonna be destroyed anyhow. So why would we even continue?
Because the Russians would hit back. So let's not discuss that. That's very. He didn't explain that in those words, but that's my interpretation. And the more I learned in the following years about it, yes, it's very morose to think about the follow-up.
But even if Germany is destroyed, you could still live in France, for example. So it is pretty. But it was. I think that now when people are discussing the nuclear umbrella, it's a lot of discussion about nuclear umbrella, that if US does not really come to our help, then the French nuclear umbrella could possibly, and so on. But you think it is it's not. It is really a kind of misunderstanding of the difference in strength, and France would be destroyed if you had a nuclear war between France and Russia. I mean, Russia has a little bit more territory than France, and France had quite a lot of people concentrated in different. It will be an enormous destruction, and you couldn't. So, in practical terms, it's impossible.
Absolutely. This is in fact the point of I mentioned originally three reasons for having nuclear weapons. One is the ultimate weapon. Yeah, I mean the weapon of last resort. If all fails, if your country is about to be annihilated anyway, or your state is to be annihilated. That is all, of course, a matter of perception of the political elites, or if it is the people. Anyway, we're not discussing that. But in the case of your state is about to be annihilated, you then show the opponent or the enemy that you're prepared to commit suicide, but you take him with you. That's basically what the French and the Brits are doing, and that is basically what some German idiots are now trying to put into our heads, because you cannot, and having a French nuke is absolutely idiotic, because if you don't trust the American umbrella, how can you trust the French to be prepared to commit suicide for the Boche, which many French are still considering the Germans to be? Yeah, and no way. It was in that period of the deployment of the Pershing and cruise missiles, early 1980s. The French also tried to bring themselves again more into the strategic discussion. Although militarily outside NATO, many people don't remember that, the French were still a part of NATO. They were part of all the other branches of NATO, only not the integrated military planning, because the goal introduced that no American soldier will fight under the command of an American.
No
General.
No French.
No French soldier under guard. So, and so they were not in the integrated military planning, but for the rest. So there was, but they did want to bring themselves again more into the political and strategic discussion, also in view of the so-called nuclear military modernization. So they created a FAR, Force Armée Rapide, or something, a rapid deployment force that was supposed to go forward to the German border, and they tried to push that also into German and NATO planning. So being outside NATO planning, but still wanting to have a back door to get in. And the commander of this was quite frequently at NATO too. And when I was in Paris on another matter, he invited me for lunch, and and I asked him, do you really think, because this force Armée Rapide also was supposed to be with mobile tactical nuclear weapons, yeah, that was the idea, to be then put forward on GDR, inner German border. And I asked him, would you really ever think that the French would use nuclear weapons in the defense of Germany? He said, no, I cannot imagine it, that will never happen. Why? I said, well, it would be only under one condition, which I cannot not imagine it will happen. That is, if French interests, French political, economic, cultural interests are so interwoven with the Germans that you can't distinguish one from the other anymore. And that will never happen. Yeah. And now they are thinking.
But I was thinking, I was thinking about the Northern Europe, and when you had in the early 90s, we invited Soviet or also former Soviet, now Russian general, but he was heading the planning for the Leningrad military district 76 to 86, except for a couple of years when he was heading the forces in Afghanistan. But his point was that the Soviets would, to defend Leningrad, to defend the Kola bases, Kola Peninsula, and to defend the communication in between, the railways and all this, you had to take Finland and Finnmark in Norway. So the whole Finland, so the preparation for the Leningrad military district forces were primarily for taking Finland. But one should not take Sweden and not Norway, actually south of or further west or south of Finnmark. And that was the art, or they should try to destroy the bases, actually. And I asked him, but if American uses Swedish which were part of the planning in the 1960s, to use Swedish air bases. And that was supposed to take place already from the very first day of the war. And he said that we would take out these Swedish bases and the Norwegian air bases. And of course, this was, you don't take out air base with conventional weapons so easily, because it was you have to have a permanent bombing of these bases in that case, and you would lose, very, very much bombers, bomber forces. So it means that in practice they had to take out these bases with nuclear weapons. And so when Olof Palme came to power in 1969, it seems that he had shied away from this policy. I mean, he understood that you make yourself into a target, and that was it was obvious that you had to avoid this kind of problem. The problem for the Americans and the British was that they needed Swedish territory. They needed Sweden as an unsinkable aircraft carrier to take out, to have air cover over the central front, to open up air defenses in the Baltic republics at the time, and open up for the strategic air forces to hit Moscow and St. Petersburg, Leningrad. So that was. So how do you do that? I mean, the Russians or the Soviets understood, of course, that if they attack Sweden, the American Air Force will immediately come to Sweden, so they wouldn't attack Sweden. that was a problem, and of course, the Americans had to find a way for the Soviets to attack Sweden, so they could use Swedish territory, and that was, I think, the major issue there was this submarine thing, that you're pretending it was Soviet submarines, and you went there with small Western submarines that they had there for a long time, but they showed up in.
To get to the Swedish air bases, they used Soviet submarines.
Yeah, but the problem was that it was not Soviet. I mean, it was one Soviet submarine, but it actually was.
I must explain something here for the people listening, because this is an internal joke, because of course Ola is the #1 expert worldwide on the so-called submarine scare that developed in the 70s and then the 80s in Sweden, when there were submarine sightings in front of Sweden, and everybody was, oh my god, the Russians. But turns out most of these submarines, except for one at the very beginning probably, were actually NATO submarines, in order to scare the Swedes, who were not part of NATO, into, starting planning with NATO for those kind of contingencies. I mean, and this is kind of this internal joke here going on.
Yes, the Swedes had to adapt, and they didn't understand that what was important to defend was Britain and United States, and the countries in between were of less importance, really. So it was, I mean, it's the same logic as you come to the nuclear issue with the destruction of Germany, which was, would totally destroyed. And in this case, it would be also the Swedish air bases would be destroyed by nuclear weapons. But because the whole idea with the submarines were that you make the Swedes, I mean, firstly a psychological operation in peacetime, but also in wartime, primarily in wartime, you would make the people believe that the British submarine that is coming in with special forces, that they always did actually, very secretly training with the stay-behinds, they would take out the political leadership or the military people who were not on board, and then so you take out all these people, decapitation you could say, and then of course Sweden would join US from one day to the other. So it's very efficient, and of course that was not very public, put it that way.
Rainer?
We in the deterrent discussion, we left out an important part of history, because we came to, we went over Honest John to Lance, etc. But the Germans, in particular, were not very satisfied with that setup, and it was Helmut Schmidt, who is considered to be one of the best German chancellors, but it was Helmut Schmidt who had the idea to, and he had discussed it first also with Giscard d'Estaing, and with Callahan, his British colleague, that we need a new modernized nuclear weapon, medium-range nuclear weapon, US nuclear weapon, stationed in the NATO countries along the borders, with the capability of reaching Moscow and beyond. So a medium-range missile of up to 5,000 kilometers. And it was this fear that things could happen and Germany would be destroyed by these kind of short-range American nuclear weapons in case of a conventional crisis. Kind of was augmented by the fact that the American president at the time, Jimmy Carter, was considered to be a peacenik who was opposed to nuclear weapons, and he did not. And in the case of a conflict with the Soviet Union, there was all the more a big question mark in the German media, in the German political discussions, a big question mark about how valid is still the American nuclear umbrella. So in 1979, there was this conference between these four heads of states. I mean, there's three Europeans I just mentioned, and Jimmy Carter at Guadalupe, and at a seaside resort, and it was all very relaxed in the swimsuits and towels, and we just discussed nuclear weapons. And the outcome of this was that what's his name? Helmut Schmidt had his way. They pressurized. I mean, with Giscard d'Estaing and Callahan, they pressurized Carter. And Carter, of course, was not surrounded by peaceniks, but we just have to remember who was his national security advisor. this Russian hater, Polish-American Brzezinski. And so out of this developed, and it actually was decided then, the political decision was actually taken in 1979, that NATO would modernize its nuclear forces, medium-range nuclear forces, 106 Pershing IIs modernized to be developed for that specific purpose. I mean, the Pershing 1 existed already, but the Pershing II was just to be go further and faster, with the capability of reaching Moscow within 10 minutes. That was also specified. And another over about 500 cruise missiles, also nuclear-armed cruise missiles, to be spread from I think the Scandinavian countries didn't participate, but it was spread from Holland, Belgium, to Italy, and I can't remember the other. And so all in all, with again almost 700 tactical nuclear weapons for the use of these weapons. And then Carter didn't get a second term, and Ronald Reagan came to power with the neocons, the very, very bellicose neocons. And what originally was perceived or constructed by Helmut Schmidt and his German military advisors to have a kind of stronger link between the use of nuclear weapons in Europe with the use of also increasing the threat for the American forces, for American mainland, by hitting Russian territory. That idea was then perverted by the neocons, by Wolfowitz, Perl, the Prince of Darkness, and etc., because they saw a chance in the capability of the Pershing II, these 104 Pershing II, with extreme, I mean, they had a Treffsicherheit, what we call it, an accuracy of about 10 meters. Yeah. So you didn't need huge nuclear, many kilotons to take out a headquarter, or a ministerial complex, or etc. So they saw the chance for their to implement their old dream of a decapitation strike of this Soviet command, control, and communication systems. And so that, in the end, the Red Army would run like a chicken with already decapitated, which is still, I've come from the countryside, I've seen it, running still over the courtyard before it collapses. Nobody is capable anymore to take any decision. And the Russian population is greeting the liberators, the Americans, the way they did it in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere. And that was the idea. They perverted this issue, and as a result, we also had this development in Germany, the anti-nuclear development, etc. So I think that now it comes as the parallel, which brought us subsequently to this Able Archer, Rian Able Archer crisis, 1983. Now we see a new development to almost repeat this problem. If Trump does not really stand to his word of saying these new weapons foreseen to be deployed by the I think by summer next year, new medium-range missiles that can reach Moscow also within a few minutes and beyond, which it was Biden who pushed it onto Scholz, and on Chancellor Scholz, and Scholz said yes. No discussion in Parliament, no nothing. Now, these, and that comes here, what the parallel just comes to my mind to the Nike nuclear arming of the Nike anti-air missiles, because Biden said, okay, yes, but these missiles will only be conventionally armed. They will only be conventionally armed. And my good friend Ted Postol said, this is absolute crap. This is idiotic because conventionally armed, don't serve any purpose. Yeah, it's quite clear once they are there will be the tactical nukes to go there. Now, what happened in 1983? We had the crisis, and a perception crisis, admittedly, but a serious perception crisis, and not which brought us to the edge of a nuclear war, where the Russians actually were thinking out of this able archer maneuver, out of the movement. The Americans would do that, implement that decapitation strike of which they've been swashbuckling so much. And they were prepared to take these out in a preemptive strike with also tactical nukes to get the way before they could start. Now, we're going to see, the possibility of a repetition, or at least that the groundworks for a repetition of such a crisis would be laid if we agree or if we deploy these kind of missiles in Germany, is for me very obvious. Why should the Russians react differently?
Yeah. If you
And also
before accepting the program decapitated, let's decapitate the Germany, full stop.
Yeah, if you only have 10 minutes reaction time, then the incentive to strike first is just very high if you feel any kind of threat that it might be used. But Ola, please speak to what you've just heard.
No, I mean, before in the 70s and so on, and also largely in the 80s, it was the Americans perceived that they had escalation dominance. They believed that in the final analysis, they would have the last card. And the problem is that this is not this is no longer the case with the very fast Russian hypersonic missiles. The Americans cannot do anything about them, but the Russians may be able to take down U.S. missiles. So the situation when it comes to escalation dominance have been turned upside down, and that psychologically that means that Americans withdraw from Europe. Actually, that's because they realize that they have no way they would go into a war that they will risk of losing, really. So this is but may I just put in one more, because in your last interview you brought up this with the use of the Korean Airlines 007, and this was you brought up how the bomber forces that is now described very clearly by Ben Fisher, as you mentioned, at when they went towards Soviet territory in the north, and they were able, and they did it regularly on sometimes several times a week or something like that, and then you received the report about the satellite had picked up the nodes of communication that of course in a real war situation would be taken out. And then came the same thing when it comes to the Korean airline 007, when it in 1983 went over from Anchorage over Kamchatka and Sakhalin actually, and was shot down by the Soviets. And this was a regular airline. The problem was that you received the report about the communication nodes in the east around Kamchatka and so on. And the a couple of points there. Firstly, a person in the National Security Agency, what was at a very central position, said that they sent from the base in northern Japan, I've forgotten the name now, a National Security Agency base in northern Japan. They knew exactly what happened from 2 hours before. They followed the communication. They sent messages to the White House with highest priority 3 times. And there were enough time for the Americans to stop it. There were very clear possibilities. They could easily have stopped the whole case, because it was a communication that went on for, I think, up to 2 hours or something like that. And that was, so actually, for some reason, now you could say Reagan was in California at the time, and also I think his national security advisor was also in California. But still, there was enough time to stop this shooting down, and they didn't. The second issue is that there was another Korean airline flight 5 years earlier that went not over the very secret base of Petropavlovsk in the Kamchatka, but over Murmansk. And it was the same procedure almost. But it landed on a lake, and the people survived. So this was and Korean airline had some special ties to some people in the intelligence community. But I think, and the third point that I want to mention is that in Sweden, there was the same thing happened against the radar systems in the Baltic, where a Swedish airplane that was not yet introduced into the Swedish Air Force, that was from the Saab aircraft company, for some reason went towards the Baltic states and had an attack on the Baltic states, and then and they knew at this very week the incident ready part of the Soviet Air Force was on a exercise in Ural. So they have used this special occasion to go into the Baltic to check out the radars and or communication nodes and whatever, and then they were, and this was be in mid or late 70s, I think, mid 70s maybe. So this was a very, very clear that they were using these, civilian airplanes, and huge amount of people died because of the shoot-down. And I think it's a pattern, sort of call it that way. This was really, they really, people in U.S. and the chief of National Security Agency and so knew perfectly well what's going on.
Rainer, do you believe that the U.S., that NATO was actually playing with
Not this
civilian aircrafts in order to provoke the Soviet Union? Rainer?
No. I think then anyone who thinks that way, that NATO, something like this, could have emanated from NATO headquarters, doesn't know how this organization works, because you have committees, and in NATO There were many times you had governments which didn't agree with the Americans or this, that, or the other. You would not, whatever, you could not have a NATO decision on this. Like I've always said, there would not have been, it was impossible for NATO to have an attack plan or decide on an offensive attack plan against the Soviet Union, because there would always have been a NATO government who would have been against it. So that could not happen, as an official, like a Operation Barbarossa, something like that wouldn't have been able to be done in NATO. But NATO, in NATO, you have every NATO country has its own embassy, or secured, especially also from NATO. So it's secured in the NATO compound. So it provides plenty of bilateral, trilateral discussions, secret discussions, etc., which do not touch NATO whatsoever. And which is so things like that are possible. And if somebody then said, at NATO we discussed, it could only be something of that kind, but not a NATO decision, not in a NATO committee.
No, I mean, that was also.
You understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. No, I think when I spoke with maybe you met Vidlek Eide, who was chairman of the NATO Military Committee in early 1990s, like around 1990, like 4 years maybe. And he said that when it comes to the very secret things, like the submarine I mentioned before, but also like these operations, these could never be a NATO operation, because it was too secret to run within the framework of NATO. This was U.S. operation together with single countries, and they were running very dirty things. Now Rainer disappeared.
I think that his connection is getting worse and worse, unfortunately. Rainer is, I think he's coming back. One moment. Here, you're back. Hello, Rainer. And we are reaching the 1 hour mark anyhow, my friends. So maybe I would just like, maybe as a final word from both of you, like this idea of a nuclear umbrella and also the protection of NATO. It has always been a double-edged sword, hasn't it? It was always on one end, yes, we can protect you maybe, and on the other end, no, it will destroy you if used.
Yeah, clear. I mean, I mean, I think this nuclear umbrella and the use of nuclear weapons in Germany and use of nuclear weapons in Norway, this very clear. It shows that the idea is to defend, but in the final analysis is to defend Britain. It's not continental Europe, and the continental Europe will be largely destroyed.
Rainer, is that also your assessment that the strategy basically was to sacrifice Central Europe over the interests of the UK and the United States?
Well, that was the strategy in the past, and I think that strategy is now under question for a long time, and in reality things are moving away. Once the Americans are out of the equation, which it looks to me they are already out of the equation, they are not prepared to. During the Cold War, even Germany, we had to say, when we wanted to question the nuclear umbrella, we asked the Americans, "Are you prepared? Berlin for Boston, yeah. You understand? If the Russians take Berlin, you promise to use nuclear weapons, but are you prepared to risk Boston in return?" Yeah, so Berlin for Boston, that was the kind of phrase. Now, the Berlin for Boston issues type of thing, I think, is gone. The danger is that some scrambled brains in Germany and in Europe, especially in Germany, try to slip under another nuclear umbrella, the French or the British, or develop a European nuclear force. I mean, a European nuclear force would only consist out of British or French, and again, would the British decide be prepared to sacrifice their island for the defense of France or Germany, etc. You can forget about it because they haven't got the strategic depth to threaten the use of nuclear weapons. They only can threaten with national suicide. Well, if you use nuclear weapons, if Russia, look at it, United States and Russia or Soviet Union at the time, they did their first nuclear explosions of many kilotons on their own territory, above ground. Yeah, and nothing happened. You see, even if you take out Moscow with a nuclear weapon, I mean, big city, and prepare for mass murder of any kind, Russia will continue to survive. If you put Paris, if you make Paris disappear, France will not survive. The same applies to Germany. I mean, that is the difference, and that has to go into the heads of the people. But I think they don't want to.
Yes.
Anyway, you know the Chinese term. We are having interesting times, or we live in interesting times.
It is, but it would be nice if we managed to convince these lunatics in Berlin, Paris, and Washington that the only way to deal with nuclear weapons is by making sure that they will never be used. So, but we're still a little bit away from that. The Russians and the Chinese, I believe, are already there because they keep saying so the whole time. They must never be used. And we are learning new things now also through the Iran war, where a non-nuclear weapon state is successfully defended itself or is defending itself against two nuclear weapon states. But that's a discussion for another time. I would like to thank both of you for your insights and this historical and contemporary discussion. Ola Tunander and Rainer Rupp. See you next time again.
Thank you. Thank you.